After all this, you still...
I still want that gas, yes. And you had better deliver.
All right, let's get right into it. The greenhouse, everybody. It's me and Josh today, and we'll be covering a bit more of the fallout from recent congressional events. Obviously, I don't think we're super late to these topics, but mainly today, I think our intent is to cover the now late Senator Dianne Feinstein's, as well as some of the fallout from this unprecedented ouster of Kevin McCarthy from the Speaker of the House.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot to kind of get into today, right? I mean, I think Feinstein, for a while, has had one of the more interesting and complicated legacies, I think, of most sitting politicians, right? And like usually, it's pretty easy to kind of square. And I think today we're probably going to mostly cover, maybe the more negative aspects. But you sort of see the celebration of her as like this trailblazer, a female politician when they weren't as common, things like that. But I think that there's a lot more nuance that is sort of obscured by the fact that we sort of always kind of do these, maybe not exactly a rehabilitation in her case, because I don't think she necessarily had like a public opinion that was like in the tubes. I mean, certainly her late tenure into office, where she clearly had dementia, where her staff was entirely running the show. I mean, that was harming her legacy, but I think there was harmful attributes to it beforehand that I think are maybe under-examined by a lot of the public, and certainly by the more celebration that you see of her life and legacy that you're seeing from a lot of mainstream politicians in the media.
Yeah, and also I think the perception of her political origins in San Francisco, I think it's very easy to dismiss San Francisco as this kind of Democratic stronghold, the quote unquote left coast, as it gets called, blah blah blah. But if you look at some of her early career, she's actually emerging from tumultuous local circumstances, as well as what you can probably view as like a very early imposition of like a new style of urbanism, as well as this weird balance between reconciling that era's radical politics with law and order conservatism. And she kind of emerges from those circumstances in a very, I'd say, somewhat tragic way almost, but at the same time, it's a wild story, and the context is lost to us in the present. It seems it's very easy to write people off for what we remember them for. It's also harder to write them off for what we don't remember them for, as we'll find out.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, so let's see. I'm just trying to find the books we got recommended. Because before we start, I do want to shout out a friend of the show, Modest Mouse. They did provide us with some reading on her early career. At least it helped me flesh some of this out. So I got recommended Season of the Witch by David Talbot, which is a kind of like narrative-driven history of San Francisco. Kind of how, and the premise of the book is like how the Summer of Love may or may not have ushered in this kind of bizarre era of California liberalism. And then the other book is Pictures of a Gone City by Richard Walker, who I think was a professor at UC Berkeley. That's a bit more of the drier read, but it's like a real economic analysis of like Silicon Valley and political developments in the Bay Area. So both were great reads. I didn't get to read them as closely as I'd like, but they did help me get some context on how Dianne Feinstein came to emerge in the Bay Area scene, and kind of how she was able to springboard that into her Senate career. So I will say I'm probably not as well versed with her Senate tenure as Josh is. So I'll try to go through her early career as thoroughly as I can, and then we'll jump into her Senate tenure and the real impacts of that. So,
yeah, I think that's the logical way to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, time only goes in one direction, as you'll find out. So yeah, Feinstein is pretty has a pretty good pedigree for a political figure. You know, she graduates from Stanford University in 1955 with a Bachelor of Arts in History and was a fellow at the Coro Foundation in San Francisco, which is an organization, I think it was founded by like attorneys and like stockbrokers, if I understand. And it was an organization that provides young people with political experience. And she was able to use that to get appointed to the Women's Parole Board in 1960, and she served there until 1966. The Coro Foundation has a lot of pretty prestigious graduates in it. A lot of like California state and like state level politicians are for sure graduates from it. But fellow program graduates also include current senators Mike Bennett, Tim Kaine, and Alex Padilla.
So not necessarily the Rolls Royce politicians that are known for anything that's like tremendously positive.
You could argue like what is the celebrity status of like politicians today versus in yesteryears, right? Where it's like senators, I think, used to be a lot more prestigious and they used to have a lot more celebrity. Like who was the guy at the Scopes Monkey trial? I'm trying to remember who, William Jennings Bryan. Like he was a celebrity in his day, right?
Yeah.
Now senators not so much. Usually most of the attention gets like taken up by like the president, maybe members of like the House, if even. But it's like again, like the Coro Foundation seems to pay off. You can get if you manage to qualify for that fellowship, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now she's able to then make a jump to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. That's basically their city council and their county government in 1969, and remained on the board for 9 years and had this reputation as like a centrist Democrat. Talbot's book, the scene in San Francisco at this time is actually pretty wild. You know, you've got this kind of old world, very conservative, like old money politics that wants to maintain its authority over the city. You have radical elements and the, you know, like very active gay scene in San Francisco. That's the jump. That is, you know, facing like the brunt of some of that. And then you're also just in this crazy backdrop of the Zodiac Killer, you know, Jim Jones, all that shit. What else? And like the Jim Jones stuff, it gets super crazy because like they end up killing like a San area like congressman. So the reputation of Bay Area politics as being obsessed with crime may have some genuine origins. You know, like this was a pretty wild scene for politics in, I want to say, the late 60s, early 70s.
Yeah, for sure.
At a local level, yeah. And during Feinstein's tenure on the board, she was a target of the New World Liberation Front, which was the local city-level terrorist group that carried out bombings in the 70s. They placed a bomb on the windowsill of her home that failed to explode. And they were also just like targeting a lot of like what they deemed to be conservative elements in the city. You can read more about it in Talbot's book. To that end as well, she later makes it as mayor under very just very tragic and very strange circumstances. So the prior mayor, George Moscone, and another influential board member at the time, Harvey Milk, who was like a leading scene in like the city's gay community, are killed tragically by another member of the board. What was his name? David White. And there's like a bunch of crazy stuff.
Yeah, it was Dan White.
Dan White, exactly. And there's crazy stuff going on at this time in local politics in the area, right? Like, you can read about this in Talbot's book, but like George Moscone's like electoral strategy unintentionally relied on like Jim Jones and the People's Temple for like door knocking efforts.
Okay.
And that was a whole scandal at the time. You know, Harvey Milk is making waves as this like very like brash and like out of the closet gay politician. And was also like, I don't necessarily know about his like policies per se. My reading and my knowledge of all this is very surface level, but he was kind of like trying to do like a local version of like Rainbow Coalition stuff, or like him as a gay leader tying up with like black churches with union politics. And he was this very well liked political figure. And he had this like he kind of did like what we accuse the Democrats now of, right? Where it's like, no, you have to be nice to people even if you disagree with them. But in his case, it would pay off.
Right, yeah. And I mean, that's kind of just... And to be fair, I mean, I'd hesitate to say that it's entirely a useless strategy, even today. But the fact that you can see the more obvious dividends being received there is probably the part that's a little bit more,
yeah,
rose-tinted glasses of nostalgia a little bit, kind of like we're... Not that it's, we are exaggerating it, right? But it's like, it's sort of like, this is sort of this bygone age where it feels like that paid off a bit more than it does now.
It also seemed to have been executed a lot more smartly on his end. One, you can just do these things a little more effectively at a local level than you can with like national partisan politics, for example. But it also seemed to be like a kind of, yeah, we're friends. You scratch my back, I scratch yours, kind of classic city politics. So these and George Moscone himself, he's this educated Catholic leader in the community, but sets himself up as a progressive type. He's not exactly perfect either, but he kind of sees himself as the kind of, yeah, we can integrate the city's reputation for wealth as well as its like radical and artistic and diverse elements. I don't see a problem with this. He was that kind of guy, although to be fair, he would always butt heads with the police, and that's not here or there. But Feinstein kind of comes up in still as a Democrat, but in the middle of, I'd say further to the right of these guys. I wouldn't say that she was vociferously like conservative, but definitely something that comes up in Talbot's books is a gay activist is quoted as saying her homosexuals were not Harvey's homosexuals.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm just trying to...
I mean, it's known that like when he was still alive, that like he did view her as like something of an obstructive force to some of his agenda, too. So it's there's how like I mean I don't think it's necessarily, and when we say obstruction now, it means something kind of totally different from what it means like back then, right? Where it's just sort of like obstruction is a barrier that can be overcome back then, whereas like now we just think of like, oh yeah, like the house floor has been nuked and there's no speaker, as we'll discuss later, right? That's that's kind of a different level than
exactly
than where we were back in the that era.
Of course. And then also like at the same time, like they have like an early version of like a progressive prosecutor who's also like not as harsh on like prostitution, for example, in San Francisco. So like you have like a very strange scene. It's not the kind of usual city politics you see, especially here in like the Midwest or on the East Coast. And I'd say that the old money of San Francisco was not always represented until like it started to consolidate behind certain people. And it's, it was harder for conservatives, especially in like a very radical space, to get traction. So Einstein kind of comes in after, White kills Biscone and Harvey Milk, honestly, she was at the scene of the crime. It was pretty tragic, like what she observed that day. And in a closed session later on is basically given the mayorship, right? But and it was also like this was viewed with suspicion even then. Like elements were very, you know, upset about Harvey Milk's death, suspected foul play. Then I can't comment. You know, that's not.
Well, I mean, obviously it's assassination. There's always foul play.
There's always foul play, and it's like you know, it's one of those things where it's like, I mean, who stands to benefit more from this than Dianne Feinstein? But her mayorship is kind of marked by this this push for law and order politics. That's how you get the old money conservatives to shut up. That's how you present, at the time, you present yourself with this like facade of like a fair face when it comes down to like how you deal with radical or more like ostracized elements in society. And you could argue that her tenure kind of sets a tone for early neoliberalism in city politics. I can't comment on that decisively. I would maybe defer to pictures of a gone city to see how the socioeconomic situation plays out in those dynamics. But you know, she kind of like exists at the origin of this law and order crime panic, as well as this backdrop of just crazy events going on in the Bay Area. And that's her political origins, where she comes in as mayor of San Francisco. And I think we've all seen like the Twitter thread after she died of like strange calls of, you know, like pushing for the prosecution of black activists so they could keep the Confederate flag flying in San Francisco.
Well, yeah, and I think, you know, specifically that San Francisco one's worth delving into a little bit more. Well, I mean, yes, it's all in San Francisco, but the Confederate flag is the reason it was done was because I believe they were hosting the Democratic National Convention, and it was a way to cater or like build support with Southern Democrats.
Yeah, because they were still around that time. That's
yeah. So you know they're still around, and this was an effort to sort of appease them. Obviously, you know that flag, not that excuses it, right? Because like that's sort of this incident that you'll see kind of people like mention like every so often randomly about her, when she was still alive. That like why would you do this? Like it's not like California was, you know, seceded or anything like that,
right?
And that's sort of the context there. So it's sort of, you know, this kind of
that comes up in her career, that like how she handled the events of the Democratic Convention in San Francisco at the time played a major role in like, because radical politics was big this era, you know, like there were the big like DNC protests in Chicago, and you had the Chicago 7, all that shit go on, right? So I think her trying to either suborn or like suppress those elements to maintain like a allegedly more peaceful convention is both like a reflection of that law and order philosophy, as well as like a way to signal to the state and national party, hey, I can control the left in my neck of the woods. I can keep them on a leash, you know?
And that is sort of like the start of this era where that is sort of, you know, that's increasingly becoming a major push, right? Not necessarily like controlling the left, right? Because that had been sort of this struggle with, you know, when you had a more militant left presence in this country. But it's, you know, this desire to sort of, you know, separate out, like, you know, like kind of really move the Democratic Party to more so that, you know, center left, arguably center right wing, that doesn't fully materialize until later, right? But like obviously, you know, it's sort of that Reagan era that this is sort of at the start for, that pushes that, you know, completely away.
Yeah, and you even see this in some of like, you know, her other decisions, right, with like vetoing a rent control provision, benefits to unmarried couples.
Mm-hmm.
What else? Like, again, just like weird fear mongering about like immigration. It kind of is this new synthesis of how do you keep old money happy, but you have this like respectability of liberal politics. Because let's be honest, like the American right is pretty gross to observe. You never like talking in that like really xenophobic, really like blood and soil type of shit they're on these days, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if you kind of deliver all the things they want, which is we still get to make our money, we don't have to look at anything we don't want to look at, and you keep the riffraff out, yeah, we'll have a few rainbow flags. That's fine.
Yeah. Helps when they're not being, constantly, called pedophiles and stuff like that. But,
right.
On today's media, but, it helps.
Yeah. So, I mean, to basically say, like, it is very true that she is a trailblazer in a time when women just do not hold all the cards in politics at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And in Talbot's book, they even get into how, like, she just attracted the worst in male political opponents. Like, they always were able to lean heavy into the sexism against her. So like that part is always like, I don't think that can ever be downplayed, right? That I think there is an element of sexism that has to be reckoned with in the American political sphere. At the same time, though, like, Feinstein is a very shrewd and very measured political figure in this local scene. And I think, like, one, with her educational pedigree, and then two, with like this dark fortune or misfortune as you look at it, right, is able to like put a major administrative milestone on her resume with her mayoralty of San Francisco. And like, of course, it's not the politics that you or I agree with. It's not politics that you or I would see as, doing anything to ameliorate present conditions today. But that was the direction the country was headed at the time. And she delivered on that, for sure. And I think that's the best I can do to summarize her early career. Otherwise, we're gonna be here all day. I don't think we're here to be, like Harvey Milk assassination truthers. But I will say that, like, it is one thing that is still like a Bay Area 9/11 almost, like with the amount of theories it inspires, and that was just an interesting thread to observe.
Yeah, I think that's fair. So I guess we can get into her Senate tenure, right? So she's elected on a special election in '92. I can't remember. Let me double check on who she replaced. I believe. Let's see. John Seymour, who was a Republican.
Okay.
Let's see. He himself was appointed, but lost a special election to Finn. Okay, so he was appointed to continue Pete Wilson's term. Why was he removed? Oh, he ran for governor. So fun stuff. So he runs for governor, gets into that office, appoints this guy. Then there's a special election. Dianne Feinstein wins there. And this is in 1992. So this is firmly in what is often called the Year of the Women, where a lot of women and a lot of female politicians won elected office. A lot of this is attributed to the Clarence Thomas hearing with the Anita Hill scandal and all that, and how she was, in particular, it was like a lot of people say it was like the visual of, like, because those hearings were televised, of just seeing like all of these like old white men or older white men, interrogating a young black woman. There's no women on there. Right. And, so they're kind of insensitivity towards her allegations of Thomas's sexual misconduct and whatnot is sort of seen as this big motivating force to sort of get women in office. And to be fair, the Year of the Woman, I mean, it is historic. I'm not going to take that away from it, but it's not like a ton of women got into office. Notably because she won that special election, she got in immediately. She did get a couple months tenure boost over Barbara Boxer, who was also elected that same time, except it was for the other seat, which was naturally up for re-election. Barbara Boxer, I note in the outline, she retired a while ago, and she's currently age 82. So again, maybe she substantially younger than Feinstein when she retired, and clearly, I think maybe that should be considered. When we kind of weigh in on like the gerontocracy part of this, right? That not everyone is necessarily seeing it beneficial to remain in office for a million years. Yeah, but she was there for quite a while.
Yeah, and like I think with moves like that, I don't think anyone really has anything bad to say about Barbara Boxer. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like no one ever, like those who like remember her, like generally remember her pretty fondly. And those who don't obviously, but it's like I think it's I think there's something to be said about that, right? That was a politician who kind of read the tea leaves. Obviously, she was replaced by Kamala Harris when she left. But yeah, so I was actually just scrolling through a list of some of the bills that Feinstein herself had sponsored. And it's kind of interesting because there's a few ones that I did not realize were being passed quite this like in the late 90s, early 2000s. But so she her first bill that gets passed is like this California Desert Protection Act. But then there's a few other private laws. So these are basically laws that are like normally like the welfare state's pretty well established, obviously today, right? And in the 90s and 2000s it was as well. But you still have some of these private laws where basically you have a law that's like literally worded a bill for the relief of Guy Taylor. Or a relief for Tony Lawrence. So these are basically, and like the Guy Taylor one specifically, it gives him like the government is insuring him in that law. So like private laws are these weird thing. They used to be way more common, especially like in the before the New Deal, and you had like the welfare state. Notably, like Civil War soldiers had like pensions that had to be passed like long after the Civil War, and there was a sort of this weird legacy to it. But it's interesting seeing that like these were from the 106th Congress, so that's 1999 to 2000. It's interesting seeing those private laws stick around. There's a few kind of renaming things, right? We've got got the John C. Corman Federal Building, a bill to extend the special postage stamp for breast cancer research for 2 years. Some stuff, there's a few things, right? There's some environmental things, Public Lands Corps' Healthy Forest Restoration Act. You've got the 14th Dalai Lama Congressional Gold Medal Act.
Oh boy. That did not age well.
No. Preserving U.S. Attorney Independence Act of 2007. So like some of the bills she sponsored, there's not a ton of like signature legislation, but she is relatively well associated with, and there's some private laws even in the late 2000s too. Interesting. The stuff that she's really associated with is kind of gun control, environmental policy, but I think that record is a bit mixed, right? I mean, I named the Desertification Act, but I think as global warming became a bigger and bigger concern, she has stood out as kind of out of touch with the times. And some people are like, well, it's because she's old, but again, it's like I don't think her environmental policy is necessarily to like the right of someone like Pete Buttigieg, right, who's substantially younger than her,
right?
But some of the things that are kind of worth pointing out, right? So she was a major force in getting the I can't remember what the exact year, but the early 90s gun control legislation, the assault ban passed, that was passed under Clinton. And this was kind of like, there's a few like clips that you've probably seen circulating around the internet if you've been following, the remembrance of her life and legacy and stuff like that. But there's, stuff where she really points to the assassination of Harvey Milk as like a big thing where she's like, she was there, at the scene of the crime, more or less, where like she saw this, so she used that as like this big vehicle to promote gun control legislation. Obviously, that has kind of been a bit of a non sequitur for several years now. So it's one of those issues, right, where we always talk about it with frustration because increasingly nothing changes because of just the difficulty in getting anything passed. But at least back when things did get passed, she was a strong force for the right side of that issue, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, then should we do, let's see, do we want to do I guess we'll do the Iraq War first.
Yeah, I did remember a small detail. I think I need to say this before.
Go for it.
Thread. Yeah, by the way, at the time Feinstein was on the Board of Supervisors for San Francisco, current board members at the time also included Nancy Pelosi's husband, as well as Willie Brown, who, little known fact, was dating Kamala Harris at some point later on.
What?
Yeah.
What's the age difference there?
Let's take a look. When did she start dating Willie Brown?
Well, Willie Brown's 89.
Yeah, he's old, man. Yeah.
He's older than Biden.
In 1994 and 1995, after his election as mayor, he was 30 years her senior.
Whew.
Yeah, I'm telling you, Bay Area politics is like, it's understated how it is.
That's so weird.
Yeah.
Crazy how just inbred it is too, right? Right? Like everyone's connected to each other in some way or another. I mean, that's a particularly bizarre connection, but wow.
I mean, it's again, the thing with Pelosi's husband too, that got me. That
maybe that's why she. I guess they probably known each other for years, but maybe that was part of the motivation for her to attend her funeral.
Yeah, I'm just let me take a look. San Fran City Council. Sorry, Board of Supervisors. Yeah, Ron Pelosi.
Mr. Hammer Time himself.
Exactly. From 68 to 1980.
Okay.
So and that was like an understated thing when like the Hammer Time controversy was going on. Like, of course that shit was crazy, but it's like I think everyone was forgetting he was also like a major local political figure for a significant amount of time.
Yeah, because everyone just kind of like, oh well, he's just
oh, that's Nancy's husband.
Yeah, that was kind of what we dismissed as, but it's like, oh no, this guy actually had a career and whatnot.
Yeah, and it's not to say that Nancy wouldn't have gotten anywhere without her. Without him,
right?
It's like, yeah, she was, I think, a pretty influential fundraiser for the Democratic Party at that time too. So I think that's where people working in the political sphere building these power relationships, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's almost natural than it is unnatural. But
yeah, I think that's fair.
Yeah.
So the Kamala Harris Willie Brown thing is I don't know. I don't know if there's any way to rate that one off as natural, but I can see the motivation, but I wish I didn't.
It's just you would just want to know about these details, not to be like a gawker or to be like a gossip. When you study politics, it's always good to be like, okay, that's where the connection started. Good to know.
Yeah, well, that's fair. Yeah, so I guess continuing with her Senate career, right? I think the Iraq War is probably, I've seen I think Mehdi Hassan had said that like the highlight of her career and the low light of her career are both involved with the Iraq War.
That's pretty fair, yeah.
Yeah, so there's actually a movie called The Report. It was released in 2019. It's actually about one of her staffers, Daniel Jones, who wrote what I think is usually called the Jones Report. This is the thing that disclosed the CIA use of torture.
Mm-hmm.
And she had appointed him to that position to discuss this. And the kind of value of it, right, was, we kind of, I think people kind of forget, like in hindsight, that we didn't really know like the full details of what exactly was being done in the war on terror, right? Like we kind of, and at the time this came out, like this was an incredibly detailed report. I mean, it's I think over 1,000 pages, goes through all of these things that the CIA had done. Of course, there's sort of a catch-22 where once she received the report, was a little reluctant to release it because it would look bad for the United States, of course. And they ultimately, what motivates them to release it is that they lost the Senate majority, and they knew that Republicans would just bury it. So they release it pretty much like right in that lame duck period between, when the next Congress gets sworn in. So probably like in November, if I recall correctly. So that's one thing as well that she did that I think was relatively positive, even if it was, somewhat reluctantly.
So on that thread real quick, like it almost comes up like in the spirit of like the revelations at Abu Ghraib, right? Where like info comes out and it like really sours the public perception on the conflict and specifically US involvement. So I'm almost wondering like to what extent you need this to be covered up, even though like this information came out later.
Yeah, this came out 2014.
Right, and like they cover this a lot in Spencer Ackerman's reign of the torture program and stuff, the black sites, all that crazy stuff. I think those revelations have been like even more revealing about like the fraudulence and horror of this conflict. But like even with like this report, the release and knowledge of them has been somewhat subdued, and it's just not as salient in the public eye, I've observed. I almost wonder, like, is the downplaying because like it just presents a problem for these foreign policy objectives? I don't know.
I think it's a few things, to be honest, but I think a lot of it kind of boils down to the notion that you have I think a big component really is just the fact that at the time Americans were still kind of in that patriotic fever, right? I mean, the mid 2010s, we were definitely like coming out of it, especially after like, the pretense of like the war in Iraq was, largely false. Right. So there's that component to it, but I also think that you just don't, I don't know. I think that, and it kind of gets into like this next story, right? Which is like the idea of her support of the NSA. Snowden was also around the same time. She called him a traitor. Was generally supportive of them at almost every turn, except the one time. And I remember when this came out on like the news media that they were like spying on members of Congress. And she didn't like that. She was very unhappy about that. And it always kind of came across as maybe not hypocritical, but very self-serving, right? That this was sort of an emphasis, and like other members of Congress were also upset by this, but she was sort of like the one who kind of like raised the alarm on it, that like, hey, they're spying on us. This sucks. And I think that there's still just that weird, I don't know. I as much as I think we're kind of like, as a whole, the public is sort of exhausted from like these conflicts, I think they're also exhausted about just hearing about them too. And they don't really like, like we did some bad stuff, like whatever, I'm not responsible, let's just move on. And I think that's a lot of it, to be honest.
Yeah. And it's also like, how do I put this right? It's like, one, there is the exhaustion aspect, but then it's also the what am I supposed to do about it?
Well, there's that too, yeah, and that is not necessarily super clear.
Yeah. Of course, I know I asked a very complicated question with that. That was a very big ball of yarn to unravel there.
Yeah, I was just like, oh, I wasn't expecting that, but that's fine. Because I was like, there's a lot to unravel there, right? I mean, you could do a whole episode on. I mean, and not that I necessarily see all the value in like going through like every step-by-step war on terror, everything going on there, right? But like, you know, it's still one of those things where we have like as a nation like some trauma from it, particularly obviously from the 9/11 more specifically, but like I think just the way the war on terror was conducted and everything, I think that there's still just a lot of trauma that we haven't processed through as a country that, you know, I think has led to barbaric choices on our part and just other, you know, mistakes.
Yeah, because it's almost like I don't know. The war machine continues on regardless of your consent in the matter. But we live with the effects of it day to day, and it's like, especially like, you know, if you know people who served, or you've observed in certain communities how like the military is often presented as like your only way out of your circumstances.
Sure.
We throw a good amount of our young people into this charnel house, you know. It's fucked up. But I think you're right. It's, you know, the political tea leaves of how we get into the Iraq and Afghanistan conflict, right? It's kind of like Jim Cramer on CNBC telling you to buy stocks. They said it was a good idea to buy, and everybody put their chips in. And I would argue almost to this day we're dealing with as you said, the trauma, and more specifically the blowback of that poor investment.
Well, and some of the way that we've dealt that has also been poor, right? I mean, I'd say the Trump presidency is entirely a product of grief over, like, you know, being lied to, and like for the war in Iraq, right? And just like the lack of success, like, or tangible success in a lot of people's minds for the war on terror, right? Just sort of seeing like the futility of those conflicts, I think has been the main motivation for a lot of people voting for Trump. I mean, it certainly gave him a lot of success in the Republican primary, and I think it helped him in the general too. I mean, because everyone always argued that like, oh, Hillary's the warmonger, and yeah, she doesn't have a great record when it comes to war and peace necessarily. But the notion that Trump would have a better one, and he didn't have a better one, despite, you know, all these like talks that like, oh, he's going to establish this new world order or whatever nonsense,
right?
That's, you know, going to end conflict for all time. Like, that's a whole nother story. But yeah, like, I mean, like, I just think that that's like probably like the biggest manifestation we've seen of some of like the war on terror trauma and stuff like that. I mean, there's other manifestations too, but I think that's a major part of it.
Yeah, I think that's probably the best way we can sum that up.
Yeah. Getting back on track with, you know, I think probably her worst legacy with the war in Iraq, right? So she votes in favor of the war. That's not unusual, right? Everyone was doing it more or less.
Yeah.
But where it's a problem, and of course, you know, she later said she regrets it, pretty much as every Democratic politician with any sense has said, several Republicans as well.
Right.
The problem is that her regret doesn't exactly come from the revelation of new information. This, if you want to go over to that Twitter thread real quick.
Yes.
So this is from Scott Ritter, who's a former UN weapons inspector, USMC intelligence officer. What does that acronym mean?
Marine Corps.
Oh, Marine Corps. Okay, perfect. Maybe he served with our favorite JAG. Probably not.
No.
Probably not, if I had to guess. So I kind of just wanted to read this, like, just, you know, verbatim in his words. I met Senator Dianne Feinstein once in the lead up to the 2003 invasion of Iraq. She had just recently been assigned to the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence in 2001, And it was in that capacity that she had a senior staffer from the committee ask me to come to Washington, D.C. to brief her on the Iraqi WMD and the allegations being made by the Bush administration that Iraq continued to possess them. We met in a secure conference room in the Capitol building, me, the senator, and half dozen staffers and aides. It was a polite, professional affair, with the senator asking questions and taking notes. Eventually, she confronted me. Your position is causing us some difficulty. You're making the U.S. look bad in the eyes of the world. Big red flag there.
Yeah.
I replied that my analysis and the underlying facts were rock solid, something she agreed with. I said that while I knew she couldn't reveal sensitive intelligence, if she could look me in the eye and say that she had seen unequivocal proof that Iraqi retained WMD, I'd shut up and go away. She looked at her retinue and then me. I have seen no such intelligence, she replied. She thanked me for the briefing and said it provided her with food for thought. On October 11th, 2002, Senator Feinstein voted in favor of the resolution authorizing the war in Iraq. Later, she said she was misled by the Bush administration and bad intelligence. I will forever know that Senator Feinstein is someone who had been empowered by the truth and lacked the moral courage to act on it. The blood of thousands of Americans and hundreds of thousands of Iraqis stains her soul. I hope she stands in judgment before her maker, and she is punished accordingly.
Damn. Damn.
Yeah, I mean, really dug into her at the end, especially. But I mean, yeah, that's kind of like I think for the most part, people generally take the like those statements in good faith when people have said like, "Oh, I regret voting for it." Right? I mean, it's as much as it is an easy thing, an easy cop out, right? Like, "Oh yeah, I was misled. I didn't have the information." We kind of ignore the fact that some people did have the information.
Yeah, and she was on the Intel committee for quite a long time, I imagine, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think she was still on there. Because I know there was concerns. There was an article that was, I believe, from I can't remember, but it was from a there was a Pentagon source that had said that they're concerned about the fact that you have like senators getting confidential information while they have dementia, and they see it as a national security risk. To be fair, I don't think it was just her, because there's also been several reports that I think like 14 to 15, maybe more at this point, members are on like dementia medication. So not good stuff. Let's see. I'm trying to see where she was assigned. They took her page down. That's helpful.
On Wikipedia, what?
No, they took her page down on the U.S. Senate site.
Oh, okay. Let's see, maybe Wikipedia.
What I wanted to point out, though, too, is, and I use this example in my class because it was really fascinating. I believe I think Patrick Leahy was also on that committee at the same time, and he voted against the authorization. But this is he talked about this like in his memoir, talked about this weird thing where like he would like regularly go on walks, and he like ran into like these mysterious gentlemen who had said, "Oh, hey, have you seen File 2?" or whatever it was. I think he might have been censoring it, and he said he hadn't. And they said, "Oh, you should check it out. It's really interesting." And so he looked at it, and he's like, "Whoa, like holy crap! Like this is like against what the Bush administration is saying." And then they met him again and like said like, "Oh, also look at this one." And it's like just kind of this creepy little like, these members of the intelligence committee who were kind of, I mean, they're kind of acting rogue, right? They had clearly tracked his routine, but were clearly acting to try to, prevent the war. And he went against it. Okay, is this the intelligence committee? Yeah, there she is. Perfect. Yeah, the third highest. Rubio's really the ranking member?
That's. I mean, I don't know, because the one thing you can always count on the Republicans to do is step down and get a new ghoul in.
I know in the House they have rules about that, like where like they essentially force it, but in the Senate, I guess it's I don't know how they determine their ranks there necessarily, but that's kind of weird.
Yeah, I know it has a lot more of those informal, but like if you break the rule, you will be shunned kind of nonsense.
Yeah,
with the seniority on both sides, I would reckon, but yeah, I'm pretty sure, you know. Yeah, get the Cuban guy from Florida in the Intel committee. I'm sure that was an incidental decision. I'm sure about that.
right.
No, him. I'm less worried about than Tom Cotton on that committee. Dear God.
Yeah, that's like the last part.
Tom Cotton is a ghoul. Tom Cotton is like
for sure.
You know, all the jokes about people to judge killing dogs, like that's Tom Cotton with like Afghan children, unfortunately. I'm only half joking. I'm only half joking. Yeah, that guy's demonic the way he talks about people. It's frightening. Anyhow.
Yeah, so that's kind of her involvement with 5 I guess more broadly the war on terror, but particularly the Iraq war as well. The other, I kind of guess moving on, you know, there's a few other like really real highlights or lowlights of her career. There's that infamous moment. I want to say this was it during the Trump era or was it?
It was in the early Trump years, and I would argue
it had to be like midway through, right? Because like AOC's in office by that point. Otherwise, the Green New Deal's not something people are talking about.
I would reckon so, but I would also say that like. This is probably when the first crop of Feinstein worries of like her cognition start coming in, you know? I think like
were they warranted here?
I think
so. I guess like, you know, to get to what we're talking about, right? There's this there was these school kids that were on a field trip to the state, you know, to the Washington D.C. to sort of talk about, you know, like, oh hey, let's kind of lobby members to vote for the Green New Deal, and they go to her to talk about it, and she just kind of puts them down, just like, oh, well, that's not how elected politics works, and it's just like, oh, like where are we gonna get the money from? All this stuff, and it's like, you know, pretty much.
I think it was even crueler than that. It was basically like a "you don't tell me what to do, I've been here" kind of shit. It was even crueler than that.
Yeah, but and a lot of it, as I said, it was like kind of ripped right from like conservative talking points, right? Like you know, this is expensive, like we can't vote for that. Like, not even necessarily, like, you know, the stuff that might be a little bit more, you know, tenable, like, from, like, a liberal perspective. So that was kind of a shame. But, yeah, like, why was there concerns about her mentally? I thought she seemed with it, just kind of a jerk.
That was what I initially believed, but I think, like, probably not. And my memory may be compressing events, right? But I think it's like probably that happens, and then not too long after is the first series of op-eds about gerontocracy, and then like I'd say maybe the first whispers of worries about her cognition, I would say, but I don't know if I'm compressing like a few months or a few years, you know? That's just my memory, my recollection of the sequence of events.
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely this was it raised the awareness about like the gerontocracy aspect for sure, right? Because it's sort of like, oh, well, like
they're out of touch, yeah.
Well, it's like literally the trope, right? Of like, oh, these people who, you know, have so little time left on this earth don't care about, you know, the climate for their children and grandchildren and stuff like that, or great grandchildren, probably in her case. The whole, you know, descended line or whatever. I actually don't know how many. I know she has a child, but I don't necessarily know everything else.
See. Yeah, she has one daughter, and they have. So she has a granddaughter, I'd say.
Yeah. I just don't know if it's really, you know, how much further down the line goes. Probably doesn't go that much further, but being a little hyperbolic. But
yeah.
I mean, as I said, it's kind of like, I think it highlighted the gerontocracy concerns. I actually had an interview recently where someone was asking me about like the age limits whether or not they're a good idea, and I generally don't think that they're necessarily the solution that we're looking for, because as I was saying, like, you know, at the start of this, right, you know, her positions on the climate, it's not like you have like a huge, like, you know, generational divide between who does and doesn't support like aspects of the Green New Deal, right? Because you have younger ones who don't as well. And there's just kind of that component to it. But I mean, really, I mean, like, this is kind of a low hanging fruit, right? It's not exactly something that's, you know, super impactful at the end of the day, right? Whether she supported it or not, I don't think it was going to pass in, you know, 2018, 19, whenever that was. And I don't think, you know, I don't think like her vote was necessarily pivotal in that regard, but it just really kind of came across as particularly mean spirited.
Yeah,
and you know, kind of, you know, it's a little bit of like a stain on like her climate legacy, right? Like, you can't really say that you're like a super strong climate advocate if you're not willing to like take that extra step on like anything. It's not like she was like, well, I have better ideas for how to fix this. It's just like, oh, you know, learn how Congress works, you stupid kids. Like,
you
leave me
could
alone.
at least just
Get out of my office.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. Then next we've got a lot of her. So she was also on the Judiciary Committee. So she had some top billing positions, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Supreme Court confirmations are where she kind of has a real mixed legacy. Well, actually a pretty bad one. I'd just go out and say that. So, she's voted against like every, you know, Republican that's, you know, been put before her, right? I mean, like, that's, you know, at least on the Supreme Court, right? Lower court, I'm sure she's accepted more than her fair share of you know, lower court nominees, but that's kind of the norm. So I'm not going to, you know, particularly rake her over the coals for that. But when it came to, you know, so she voted against Roberts and Alito, though. With Alito, she kind of demonstrates a little bit of like, I think that, you know, neoliberal weakness, right, of like opposing the use of the filibuster against him, because there was like legitimate questions of whether or not Democrats should filibuster him, because a lot of people at the time, and this is kind of like lost to the public record in some ways, but if you look at some of the more insider stuff, a lot of people at the time knew that Alito was like super conservative, like more than like what would typically be acceptable on the court. And they kind of just, you know, they didn't fight the good fight, as it were.
And I mean, as we have commented on in the present, right? Like, the Dobbs leak was his work, you know?
Yeah, like, I mean, like, oh, we don't know for sure, but it most likely, almost certainly was his. Yeah, I mean, just to, you know, in case he decides to, you know, give us a, you know, a cease and desist or some type of, you know, other lawsuit. I just gotta say, it's not 100% confirmed, but there's a 99.99% chance that he was the one who did it. And we know this because, like, you know, he has done it before, right? It's not like, you know, whether or not he did it specifically that time, he has done it plenty of other times. So, you know, he deserves, you know, his lion's share of the blame for, you know, the deinstitutionalization of his precious Supreme Court. So, anyway, so where I think the big problems come in is, well, I'll start with the more minor one first, right? This one got more public traction, but I think is arguably the least offensive. Is that, you know, when after the Amy Coney Barrett hearing, she hugged Lindsey Graham and remarked that this has been one of the best hearings that she's ever participated in, including hearings that she's actually run, apparently. Just really impressed with the work that Lindsey Graham did, you know, just shoving the Amy Coney Barrett down our throats.
Also, like, she was just not hard on Amy Coney Barrett at all. Like, almost.
No,
just like...
and this was the one where it was obvious that she was in total mental decline too, right? Where it was just like very clear that like this is someone who's barely aware of what's going on, and they're in this, you know, pretty important public position.
Also, like, we missed this in the outline too, but like, she had a pretty big role in botching the Kavanaugh hearings too, right?
Well, no, I was going to get into that because
Okay.
I think this is the much worse offender of what she did on the judiciary, right? Because I think this is when she's She's the ranking member at the time because Republicans still had the majority of the Senate. So she received a letter in July 30th of 2018 from Christine Blasey Ford with her allegations against Brett Kavanaugh. Look into those if you're so interested. If you don't remember or you missed out on that whole episode, right? I don't necessarily feel the need to trigger people who don't feel comfortable with that stuff if they don't want to be. Mm-hmm. And she waited until September 15th to forward this to the FBI. Notably, this is after all of the hearings were complete, and the allegations that she had towards Kavanaugh already leaked to the press at this point as well. There is, I have the book. It's been a while since I've read it because I did it for, let's see, was it Justice on Trial? I think Supreme Ambition by Ruth Marcus, Brett Kavanaugh and the Conservative Takeover. This was assigned for one of the classes that I TA'd for, and I read it then, but it's been a few years. But it goes through, in detail, how that happened, and stuff like that. So, if you're interested, delve into that book. But I think this is to me, it's a much more egregious offense than just giving Amy Coney Barrett an easy time, right? Because this is she could have stopped this confirmation had she acted sooner. And I get that her defense was Blasey Ford asked to be remain anonymous. It's okay, well, arguably you put her in a worse position where she was put in a much bigger public spotlight because of the even worse timing of it, right? And it completely backfired. Again, this raised questions of maybe not necessarily mental capability, but at least competence. And as I think this was just just kind of an egregious failure on her part on the judiciary.
Yeah, and I think that's probably been one of the biggest things to exacerbate just the worst ravages of the Trump era as a result of her own actions, right? Was putting enabling a conservative majority on the Supreme Court in a position of just poor health, you know what I mean? Poor cognition. And I think it goes to show that the gerontocracy discussion may have started with this, but it kind of just goes into a full system critique, right? Where it's we're hitting a point now where the basic functions of government may be put into risk if the class of people who hold elected office, aren't replenished. And in these entirely influential and decisive positions where someone, needs to be of sound mind to make a reasonable call, as we saw with the judicial committee hearings, right? It's you could have at least prevented some of the worst fallout that we've had to deal with these past couple of years. We've done 2 episodes now about Supreme Court fuckery since we started the show, and
probably more than that, to be honest.
Right. It's honestly I'm not saying this as a joke. It's we can just sit here and talk for days about how fucked the court is and how this new crop of justices is.
And to be fair, I don't put the blame squarely on her shoulders for it. I don't necessarily know that she could have truly stopped it, but she could have made it a lot harder. And at least I think there's value to just having people who are willing to at least I think at least inspire people from going after these guys a little bit more, right? And I think that this is as much as the Supreme Court has kind of mobilized the Democratic base through just a ton of negative partisanship, right? I
Mhm.
think that it could have. I think that those gains could be even greater if you had like people in meaningful positions who were at least like showing that like yeah, like we're not just gonna like you know send you a fundraising email because something shitty happened. We're actually gonna like give you some tangible benefits. We're gonna fight the good fight, and that's not what we've been getting out of her for the
Exactly.
past 5 years at least.
No, and I think that's the real problem, right? Because as we mentioned earlier, you have people like Barbara Boxer who, take the step out of office gracefully. You're in a position where you can protect your legacy a lot more effectively.
And hey,
And-
say what you will about like Kamala Harris, who was her successor, right? But like, I mean, I think that is she my favorite politician in the world? No, but I mean, she's definitely a step up over some of the other people in the Democratic establishment.
At least you were able to keep that Senate seat in like the hands of the Democratic Party. At a bare minimum level function of party politics, you did your job.
Well, and I think here too. I guess actually the biggest judicial fuck up, and I think I've talked about this on the show too recently. Because she was like so sick that she couldn't even physically be there. Right, her staff has been running the show.
Yeah.
And I actually looked at her legislative effectiveness scores from the Center for Effective Lawmaking at Vanderbilt University. I used their measure a bit for my own research, but I looked at them.
What is their criteria? Do you know?
A ton of things.
Okay.
So they look at bills introduced, how far they get in the process. And I think there's 3 classifications, whether or not they're substantive, commemorative, and significant. With like if it's substantive and significant and passes, that's like the biggest boost you can get to your score. But her score has been actually pretty decent more recently. And again, that's entirely her staff more or less running the show. But the one thing her staff can't do is like fill her position on that committee.
Exactly.
And there was an issue where like she didn't want to resign. Turns out God had other plans, I guess.
What is the legal like standard on this? Is like the representative or senator themselves has to say
so
they resign?
because these are votes these are actual votes like in committee and on the floor sometimes too. So like, but like to get it like to move the nominee to the next step, like they could do a discharge petition. They did that a lot last Congress, but they were losing support from like Joe Manchin to do that because of course, it's just a much slower process to have to discharge petition to get those nominations on the floor. The issue was that like Republicans didn't want to like confirm a new member to her seat. I think they don't have a choice now, because with her death, she has been replaced by this is right after I wrote the outline. Gavin Newsom appointed a new person, which it's something he had said he would do if she resigned, but there was sort of that weird like pressure to like keep her around so as to not muddle with that primary. Again, as I said, God sort of forced the hand there, but he is sort of appointed. I think this is the correct pronunciation, LaFonza Butler, who is ironically enough was a Maryland resident.
Yeah.
And the president of Emily's List, which is a major Democratic donor group, they primarily contribute to women candidates, and particularly women candidates who are pro-choice.
Yep.
So generally admirable aims. She has a career as a union organizer. She was also the president of the California Service Employees International Union. What was the others? I think she had like I think policy director of like Airbnb at one point, which is not so great.
Yeah, so she goes from like being an SEIU like union leader to then being like a political consultant and is already like advising Uber on how it deals with organized labor.
Yeah,
As well as
there's
Airbnb's director of public policy. So you can see how bad that looks.
I forgot about the Uber bit too, right? And yeah, like both of these companies that like public opinion has kind of radically turned against, I think. Where I think a lot of people just recognize this sort of the the issues with these companies and, you know, the convenience that they once provided. Though I think Airbnb especially, right, where it was like the idea that that was convenient has just kind of like disintegrated with most people, where like you're paying so much to like...
It's really gotten to the point where it's like it's actually more convenient, affordable, and probably better for everyone involved to get a hotel room.
Yeah, and it's kind of like and you've also had like sort of the real estate issues that have emerged because of like just, you know, screwing out like all these people just buying houses to like Airbnb out, and obviously only people from a certain class are really able to accomplish that.
Exactly. Unfortunate. God. Yeah, so I mean, I don't know. It's like, once again, you know, even with this move, I'm a little sussed out by Butler's record, but it's a nice win for representation. It's, you know,
yeah, she's obviously she's a black woman. She's also an open lesbian.
Right. So it is a win for representation. I can say that much. But it's like, and it's also like the bare minimum, as I mentioned. You keep the seat in the hands of the Democratic Party. Although in California, I'd reckon that's safe.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that kind of gets into it, and I have a little bit of this on the outline where it's like, you know, sort of kind of explaining how this has remained, you know, the case, or maybe it's not there anymore. But California has, yeah, it's there. The California has this jungle primary system.
Yeah.
Which is really weird. Basically, every candidate who is running for a given position is there. Republicans, Democrats, Greens, Libertarians, fascists, Nazis, you know, anyone can run in the jungle primary. You're all running against each other. And then the top two go on to the general election, right? So if it winds up that two Democrats have the majority, they're the general election. But the problem is that you can very easily end up in a situation where, and I'm not convinced, like obviously LaFone's Butler, I think, has said that she might be interested in running for re-election, and Gavin Newsom removed that little rider to his condition of appointing someone, because before he was going to appoint someone who then cannot run. So I think we've talked about this race before, right? But you have Representatives Barbara Lee, Katie Porter, and Adam Schiff all running. I imagine a few of them will drop out before they actually get to the primary because of the way the jungle primary works. Because if they split the vote sufficiently and there's, let's say the Republican gets the majority of the votes, they just win right then and there with how the jungle primary works. I think that system has been what has sort of cautioned out, like where a lot of people are, like with Feinstein, have been like, well, why don't people just primary her? And I think that jungle primary system is in part why. California, ironically, has a lot of very anti-democratic, like small d democratic institutions, right? Because like even like the recall election, right? There was that recall election against Newsom. And like it's a pretty abysmal threshold to just get like some wacko in there. Like he doesn't have to get a majority. With the way that petition is set up. And I think that's like, it's just baffling how, like, you know, like the recall petition, which is like kind of, you know, in principle, the idea of like a recall election is like maybe more democratic, right? Because it increases the number of elections, or at least potential elections. But like when it has like this weird system where like it can give you this incredibly anti-democratic outcome, it just doesn't seem worth it.
Right. And also, like, it is odd that I think we're coming off of the heels of another... Wasn't it like a couple of years ago that there was a whole ballot initiative in California about Uber workers getting some kind of labor protection or some kind of organizing rights?
I recall that, yeah.
And basically there was a similar like anti-labor push back then. So then for those same interests to have... I mean, let's. I'm not really, you know, speculating wildly here, to have probably lobbied Gavin Newsom and who he picks to make a temporary replacement for Feinstein. I mean, like that's how LaFonza Butler gets in, right? They have the pedigree to say, yeah, I'm against labor. I'm fucking on Uber's side. Get me in here.
I mean, to be fair, I don't think in the U.S. Senate she's going to be able to necessarily do much that would advance their cause. Because again, a lot of those labor issues, I mean, some of it's handled at the federal level, but those are, they have to be like kind of, and I guess Uber would be sort of across state lines and whatnot. But
yeah,
a lot of them are more localized in how they've been pursuing their, union efforts.
Of course. Yeah, I think definitely I have like a small interest in like what are like the different factions and maybe like constituencies at play in different state parties,
Yeah.
I think that's the thesis of what's that book? Is it Cowboys versus Yankees? Is that the book?
It doesn't sound familiar. But
let's see.
Sometimes you read things in a slightly different orbit from me, so
yeah, I forget which historian was writing this book. I'll try to find the text, but basically, this lens of history is like if you look at the kind of like conservatives from like the East Coast, in like finance capital and like those traditional sectors of the economy in the Republican Party, but then you also have the new money coming out of like the West and the Sun Belt, the kind of Barry Goldwater types. They get their money off of mining, industry, oil, that kind of stuff. They kind of represent these rival factions within the National Republican Party, right? And you have people like the Bushes who come in as at the intersection of both, coming from like Connecticut old money and Texas oil money. And he kind of comes in at the nexus and is able to be this kind of like mediating figure. I don't know to what extent you can look at that history, but that's stuff I've read about and I've heard people discuss. If I can find the book I'm looking at, I'll send it to you. But I have found this analysis of competing factions very explanatory when you understand why certain party infighting happens. So, if you look at like the Michigan Republican Party, for example, I'd say like you basically have suburban, like social conservatives in like the Metro Detroit area. You have the old money from the west side of the state, which is more like religiously conservative. And then you also just have just the rural right wing, like in the rest of the state, you know what I'm saying? So like, I have an interest in seeing how those factions play out. But then like this, your explanation of the jungle primary in California explains the constraints these parties are under actually. And that explains a lot about California politics in a way that like, it didn't click until today.
Yeah. And like, cause you kind of have to coalesce almost like a little, like, coalesce before the primary in some ways, maybe not like completely. Like Dianne Feinstein actually had a primary challenger at one point, but she beat him. I think it was actually it was her last election, 2016 or 2017. In terms of when that took place, I can't remember if it was like slightly off and for whatever reason. But yeah, I mean, it's this big thing, right? Where it's like, if you imagine like all of these like sub factions, and I think increasingly, and it actually kind of ties really well into our next story about McCarthy, right? Is I think increasingly you're seeing these partisan factions willing to fight each other a lot more than I think they were before.
Yeah,
right? And I think that the internal opposition within different parties has gotten louder and has gotten more willing to fight the good or maybe bad fight in some cases.
Yeah, so I mean, maybe to close the page on our discussion about Dianne Feinstein and her legacy, right? Is like, she had the opportunity to resign and didn't take it. And I think she'll be remembered for, her mistakes in her old age. But I think what will be forgotten is that she was able to coalesce the old money interest of San Francisco with the patina and veneer of like a respectable social liberalism.
Yeah, that might be the most pretentious thing you've said on this show.
Exactly. This has been part 1 of our double feature in our Profiles in Shame series covering former U.S. Senator Dianne Feinstein. The following episode, we will cover former Speaker of the House Kevin McCarthy, and is intended to be listened to immediately after this one. The links to our social media and other useful information will be posted in the show notes. Thanks again for tuning in, dear listener. We will see you in the next episode. Take care.